Chapter 4, The Rhythm of Survival. The morning mist clung to Willowbrook like a shroud, dampening the sounds of the forest and softening the edges of the small, hastily rebuilt village. 3 years had passed since the massacre, and while new life had begun to sprout amidst the charred remnants of the old village, the scars on the hearts of the survivors remained raw, a constant reminder of the brutal night that had shattered their peace. The air held a faint scent of wood smoke, a ghost of the fires that had consumed their homes, and the ever-present dampness of the forest floor permeated everything, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. Ethan West rose with the first hint of dawn, the pale light filtering through the gaps in the log walls of the small cabin he shared with his grandfather and sister. The cabin, like most in Willowbrook, was simple and functional, built with rough-hewn logs and a thatched roof. It was a far cry from the West family's former estate, a sprawling wooden manor that had been a symbol of their family's modest prosperity for generations. Now, this small cabin, barely large enough to house the three of them comfortably, was all that remained, a testament to their resilience and a constant reminder of their losses. He dressed quickly in simple, practical clothing. Dark, durable trousers made of thick linen, a loose-fitting tunic of rough hemp, and sturdy leather boots that reached his mid-calf. The clothing had a decidedly modern cut, favoring functionality and ease of movement, but was made from rougher, more natural materials, with small touches of fantasy design evident in the reinforced stitching along the seams and the intricately tooled leather accents on his boots and belt. A thin leather cord, worn smooth with use, held a simple wooden training sword at his hip, the blade dull from countless hours of practice. He moved quietly through the cabin, careful not to wake Amelia, who slept soundly in the small alcove they had partitioned for her. A soft blanket, woven with intricate patterns that hinted at a forgotten craft, covered her small form. Gerard was already awake, as always, sitting by the small fireplace, his tall, muscular frame silhouetted by the flickering flames. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He wore similar clothing to Ethan, but his was older and more worn, the dark cloak draped over his broad shoulders showing signs of countless journeys and hardships. His face, etched with the lines of age and worry, held a weary expression, but his eyes, even in the dim light, held a steely resolve. Up early, Gerard murmured, his voice deep and gravelly, like stones grinding against each other. The faint light from the fire reflected in his piercing blue eyes, which held a depth of wisdom and sorrow, a constant reminder of the lives lost and the world forever altered. "It's training day," Ethan replied, a faint smile touching his lips. He ran a hand through his unruly black hair, pushing it back from his forehead. The morning air was crisp and invigorating, promising a day of hard work. Gerard nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Discipline is the cornerstone of strength, Ethan. Never forget that." Ethan had heard those words countless times, but they still resonated with him. He knew that without discipline, his desire for revenge, the burning ember that smoldered within him, would amount to nothing more than empty anger, a destructive force that would consume him from the inside out. He had to channel that anger, to focus it into something productive, something that would honor the memory of his fallen family. He unclipped his training sword from its cord and stepped outside, the cool morning air invigorating him, clearing his mind of the lingering remnants of sleep. The training grounds were a small clearing just outside the village, worn smooth by years of practice. The ground was hard-packed earth, free of any obstacles that might hinder his movements. It wasn't much, a simple circle of cleared land surrounded by the encroaching forest, but it was enough. Ethan began his routine, drawing a deep breath and centering himself. He started with a series of basic stances, each one held for a precise count, focusing on maintaining perfect balance and posture. He felt the muscles in his legs and core engage, holding him steady as a mountain. Then, he transitioned into a series of swift strikes and blocks with his wooden sword, each movement honed through countless repetitions. The air hissed as the sword cut through it, the only sound accompanying the rhythmic thud of his bare feet on the worn earth. He focused on the flow of his movements, feeling the muscles in his arms and legs working in perfect synchronization. He imagined the weight of a real blade, the feel of steel against steel, the adrenaline of combat. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, but he didn't falter, pushing his body to its limits. He thought back to his grandfather's teachings, each word echoing in his mind, guiding his movements. He practiced his swordsmanship, focusing on footwork and precision. He imagined his enemies, the shadowy figures who had destroyed his home and taken his family, their faces blurred and indistinct, like phantoms in a nightmare. Each strike was a release of his pent-up frustration and anger, a promise of vengeance carved into the air. He visualized different scenarios, practicing disarming techniques, countering attacks, and anticipating his opponent's moves. He imagined himself facing multiple attackers, learning to predict their movements, to anticipate their strikes before they could be delivered. He practiced with a ferocity that surprised even himself, each movement fueled by a burning desire for justice. After swordsmanship, he moved on to hand-to-hand combat, practicing strikes, blocks, and grappling techniques. He moved with a focused intensity, his movements precise and efficient. His training was rigorous, pushing his body to its limits, but he never faltered. He knew that his survival, and Amelia's, depended on his strength, not just physical strength, but the strength of his will, the unwavering determination that burned within him. He had to be prepared for anything, for any threat that might emerge from the shadows. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Amelia emerged from the cabin, rubbing the sleep from her green eyes. She was dressed in a simple, light-colored dress made of woven linen, with small leather sandals on her feet. Her long brown hair was slightly disheveled, framing her youthful face, but her face held a cheerful expression. "Morning, Ethan," she said, her voice bright and clear, like the chime of a small bell. "Morning, Amelia," he replied, pausing his training and sheathing his sword. A genuine smile touched his lips as he looked at his younger sister. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes," she said, skipping over to him, her sandals barely making a sound on the soft earth. "Can I watch you train?" "Of course," Ethan said, gesturing to the log where she usually sat. Amelia sat down on the nearby log, watching intently as Ethan resumed his training, this time focusing on slower, more deliberate movements, explaining each technique as he went. She was fascinated by his dedication and the precision of his movements, absorbing every detail like a sponge. Although she hadn't started cultivating yet, she absorbed everything she saw, eager to follow in her brother's footsteps. She would ask questions about the stances, the strikes, and the purpose of each exercise. Ethan would patiently explain, using simple terms she could understand, breaking down complex movements into smaller, more manageable steps. As Ethan continued his training, he noticed a group of villagers approaching the clearing from the direction of the village center. They were mostly older men and women, their faces etched with worry, their steps slow and hesitant. They carried themselves with a heavy air of concern, their shoulders slumped and their gazes cast downwards. "Ethan," one of the men called out, his voice grave, breaking the morning's tranquility. It was Elder Elmsworth, a man with a weathered face and kind eyes, who had been a close friend of their family for many years. He was a man of few words, his wisdom often expressed through his actions, but the worry etched on his face was unmistakable. "We have a problem," Elmsworth said, his voice heavy with concern. Ethan sheathed his sword and turned to face the approaching villagers. Amelia, sensing the shift in atmosphere, moved closer to him, her hand instinctively reaching for his. The morning's peaceful tranquility had been shattered, and a sense of unease settled over the small clearing. Chapter 5, Whispers of the Wilds. "Ethan," Elder Elmsworth called out, his voice grave, breaking the morning's tranquility. "We have a problem." Ethan sheathed his wooden sword and turned to face the approaching villagers. Their faces, etched with worry and weariness, told him this was no minor matter. Besides Elmsworth, he recognized a few other familiar faces. Martha, the village healer, her brow furrowed with deep lines of concern. Thomas, the village elder responsible for maintaining order and resolving disputes, his usually stern face etched with a rare display of anxiety, and several other men and women, their expressions a mixture of fear and resignation. The air around them felt heavy, charged with unspoken dread. "What is it, Elder?" Ethan asked, approaching the group. Amelia, sensing the shift in atmosphere, stayed close behind him, her small hand instinctively reaching for his. He gently took her hand in his, offering a reassuring squeeze. Elmsworth sighed, running a weathered hand through his thinning grey hair. His gaze drifted towards the forest, a look of helplessness in his eyes. It's the livestock, Ethan. They're gone. Gone? Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. What do you mean, gone? Did they simply wander off? The thought seemed unlikely. The livestock were well guarded and the pastures were securely fenced. No, Martha interjected, her voice tight and strained. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrung them together. There are tracks, strange tracks. Not like anything we've seen before. Thomas stepped forward, his face grim, the lines around his mouth deepening. He usually exuded an air of calm authority, but now, his shoulders were slumped, and his eyes held a flicker of fear. We found them near the edge of the forest, leading deeper into the wilds. They're large. Too large for any normal animal. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. The forest surrounding Willowbrook was known to be home to various wild creatures. Wolves, bears, wild boars, but nothing that could take down a whole herd of livestock without leaving more obvious signs of a struggle. The thought of something capable of such a feat sent a shiver of unease through him. Show me, Ethan said, his voice firm and resolute. He squeezed Amelia's hand again, offering a silent reassurance. The villagers led Ethan and Amelia to the edge of the forest, where the ground was churned up and muddy. The tracks were indeed unusual, large, three-toed prints that sank deep into the earth. Each print was easily the size of Ethan's hand, far larger than any deer or bear tracks he had ever seen. The mud had been disturbed for a wide area, as if a large number of animals had been driven through the area. These are huge, Ethan muttered, tracing one of the prints with his finger. The mud was cold and damp, clinging to his skin. And they're not alone, Thomas said, pointing to a series of smaller tracks that accompanied the larger ones. These were more numerous, smaller and more delicate, but still clearly distinct. Whatever took the livestock, it wasn't one creature. It was a group. Martha knelt down, examining the tracks closely, her weathered face etched with worry. And look here, she said, pointing to small droplets of a dark, viscous fluid that glistened in the morning light. It's not blood. It's oily, almost. She dabbed a finger into the fluid and brought it to her nose, wrinkling her brow at the pungent odor. Ethan crouched beside her, examining the fluid. It had a strange, pungent smell, unlike anything he had encountered before, a mix of musk, decay, and something faintly metallic. Fear began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. This was no ordinary animal attack. This was something far more sinister. We followed the tracks for a short distance, Elmsworth said, his voice heavy with apprehension, but they led deeper into the forest, towards the Whispering Peaks. We didn't dare go any further. He gestured towards the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual haze of mist, adding to their ominous reputation. The Whispering Peaks. Even the name sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. It was a remote and dangerous region of the forest, shrouded in mist and legend, said to be home to all manner of strange and dangerous creatures whispered about in hushed tones around the village campfire. The villagers rarely ventured near it, and those who did often returned with tales of eerie whispers carried on the wind and unnatural occurrences that defied explanation. Ethan stood up, his gaze fixed on the dense forest that stretched towards the distant peaks, the trees standing like silent sentinels. We need to find them, he said, his voice resolute, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. We can't afford to lose our livestock. It's too important for the village's survival. But Ethan, Elmsworth protested, his voice laced with concern. It's too dangerous. Those tracks, whatever made them, it's not something we can handle. The Whispering Peaks, they're not a place for mortals. We have to try, Ethan insisted, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. We can't just sit here and do nothing. Our livelihood depends on it. He looked at Amelia, who stood beside him, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. He knew she wanted to come, to help, but this was too dangerous. Amelia, I want you to stay here with the villagers. It's too dangerous for you to come. Amelia's brow furrowed, her lower lip trembling slightly. But Ethan, it's not a request, Amelia, Ethan said firmly, but his voice softened slightly as he looked into her worried green eyes. It's an order. I need you to be safe. Amelia hesitated for a moment, then nodded reluctantly, her gaze fixed on her brother's face. Be careful, Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan turned back to the villagers. "I'll go," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "But I'll need some help. Who's willing to come with me?" A few of the younger men stepped forward, their faces a mixture of apprehension and resolve. They exchanged nervous glances, but their determination was clear. "We'll go with you, Ethan," one of them, a young man named Gareth, said, his voice firm. "We can't let whatever took our livestock go unpunished." Ethan nodded, a grim determination settling over him. He knew this was a dangerous undertaking, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He had a responsibility to protect his family and the village that had become their home. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steady and commanding. "Gather what weapons and supplies you can. We leave in an hour." He turned and headed back towards the village, his mind already racing, planning their course of action. The whispers of the wilds were calling, and he knew he had to answer. We hope you enjoyed these chapters. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to be alerted when we upload the next part.